Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Belfast Garden Club Evening Lecture Series, co-sponsored by the All of Belfast Climate Dialogues project of the Belfast Free Library. This year, the winter series will feature 3 talks with the focus on the effects of the climate crisis on our forests, farms, and gardens. I'm Brenda Harrington, Program Librarian at the Belfast Free Library, and I want to thank you all for joining us. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Ivan Fernandez from the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine for a talk titled Maine's Climate Future, the Role of Carbon Management in Farms and Forests. I'm joined tonight by Belfast Garden Club Program Committee members Susan Connard and Corliss Davis. Before I turn the mic over to Susan to introduce our speaker, I would like to mention that as I mentioned earlier, this program is part of the All of Belfast Climate Dialogues, or ABCD, a project of the Belfast Free Library, which we created to help all residents in our area talk about climate change and its impacts in order to increase awareness and help us all prepare for the challenges ahead. As part of the ABCD project, and because we cannot meet in person, we are seeding conversations by hosting programs like this, as well as building a collection of climate change stories and observations on our website. I invite you to go to our website, belfastlibrary.org, and follow the link to all of Belfast Climate Dialogues to learn how to participate and to look for future programs. Tonight's program is being recorded, and it will be available on the library's YouTube channel. During the presentation tonight, please keep your mic muted and type any of your questions into the chat, and Corliss Davis will read them at the end. And with that, I will turn the mic over to Susan. Go ahead, Susan.
Okay, I'm here. So before I turn the program over to Ivan, I just want to mention the other 2 programs in this series. On February 22nd, there will be again an evening program on growing food and ornamentals in a changing climate. And the third in the series is on March 22nd, and that will be Deep Woods, How Climate Change Impacts Forests and How Forests Slow Climate Change. So stay tuned for those. They'll be listed both on the library website and on the Belfast Garden Club website, and you can register on either of those websites. So Dr. Fernandez is a professor in the School of Forest Resources, Climate Change Institute, and School of Food and Agriculture at University of Maine. He wears many hats. He has been involved very much in the Maine Climate Council, and he currently serves as co-chair of the Science and Technical Committee and a member of the Natural Working Lands Working Group. And he's also involved in quite a few other national and regional climate change activities. So, Ivan, take it away.
Hang on.
This is always the tense part.
Well, I was trying to be too clever, I guess. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for that introduction and for the opportunity to be actually to be home, but to be with you via Zoom for this evening and as part of this series. I really would rather be in Belfast to have given this talk. I've really admired what your community has done and been proactive for a number of years in learning about and engaging in climate adaptation, and been involved in several activities. My colleague on this Zoom, Esperanza Stancioff, and I have participated in some of those together. And so hopefully everyone doesn't fully know everything that I'll talk about tonight. I think my charge was to actually cover a few different topics, so a bit of an eclectic collection that I will both try and weave together and also keep my eye on the clock. As you already heard, the title is Maine's Climate Future, and then within that, the role of carbon management in farms and forests. The sort of outline of what those topics are would be: the first is to talk a little bit about our changing climate. I suspect everyone on this call could give a decent talk on our changing climate already. And so this will be review or new perspectives. And then I'm a soil scientist as far as my original training and my sort of research program focus, and I teach soil science among other things at the university. So I'm going to focus a little bit tonight on a few words about soil health. You may or may not have heard a lot about soil health, natural climate solutions, and then really kind of an update of what came out of the governor's forest carbon task force. And then hopefully we have time for questions and discussions, and we'll go from there. So without further ado, the first one is Maine's Climate Future. That's sort of a catchy phrase, but it's also the title of a series of documents that we produced out of the University of Maine, Climate Change Institute, and Sea Grant, and the most recent is also including Scudic Institute as partners in developing it. That give us some of the metrics of what I like to refer to as the dashboard of our changing climate. Before we do, though, I usually make a slide literally every year that talks about the evidence of climate change all around us. And certainly 2021 was no exception. What we observe the most, what has the greatest impact or carries the news most frequently, are the extreme events. Not necessarily the incremental changes in climate, even though they are continuing and accelerating. And in 2021, I think most of you will recall a lot of what we saw in the news. We saw early in the year there was a dam burst in the Himalayas from a glacier melt that from the excessive melt waters that destroyed hydroelectric dams and killed dozens of people. We had flooding that began early and was evident throughout the year. We had a 2-foot rain in 24 hours in Hawaii on March 7th, followed by flooding in the news in China, Germany, and Italy set a world record for 29 inches in 12 hours, consistent with the intensification of rain events. In August, it rained at the summit of Greenland ice sheet for the first time, and that's not a good thing. On Friday, December 10th, the deadliest December tornado outbreak on record killed over 100 people and carved a 250-mile course through Arkansas, Illinois, Kentucky, Mississippi, Missouri, and Tennessee. Hurricane season started out as another record breaker with Claudette, Elsa, Grace, and Nicholas in the news. But it did slow in the second half of the season, yet it was the second year in a row to run out of letters of the Greek alphabet with 21 named storms, which is still the third highest on record. Ida captured headlines as a Category 4 hurricane, making landfall on August 29th, leaving devastation in Louisiana and Mississippi, only to traverse the eastern seaboard to Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. Ida was the largest storm to hit the region since Hurricane Sandy, with $64.5 billion in damage and 96 deaths, ranking as the 5th most costly weather disaster in world history, according to NOAA. Here in Maine, we experienced a number of torrential rain events again in 2021, with notable news items of greater than 5 inches of rain in Down East Maine on June 9th that washed out over 10 miles of the carriage trail system in Acadia National Park that they spent the rest of the year repairing, and still some remains. And in late October, we had a downpour that washed out roads in the mid-coast Maine that most of you are familiar with, along with power outages and flash flooding. lest you think, I know you don't, that 2021 was all about being wet. It was also a hot year. And a heat wave hit the Pacific Northwest in June and July that we read a lot about as a heat dome, breaking numerous records. And nearly half the nation was in drought by midsummer, including all of Maine. Midsummer rains brought relief in Maine in 2021, but not so for the Western United States, which continues in a multi-year mega drought. For the first time, a tier 1 water shortage was declared for the Colorado River, which has reached a low of nearly a third of storage capacity in Lakes Mead and Powell. July was the Earth's hottest month ever recorded, according to NOAA. Fires raged across the Western United States again in 2021 and continue to today, even in the winter. As of November, the National Interagency Fire Center listed over 52,000 year-to-date fire incidents in the US that were burning over 6.6 million acres, with a 5-year average fire suppression cost of $2.3 billion per year and rising. Smoke from the fires traversed the US on prevailing winds, leading to a blanket of smoke in Portland, Maine on July 28th. Nearly 1 of every 3 Americans live in a county that was hit by a weather disaster this past summer. And the US has experienced this past year 20 weather climate disasters events exceeding costs of $1 billion that included drought, flooding, severe storm, tropical cyclone, wildfire, and winter storm events. The consistent progression of these extreme events is evidence of our changing climate. The intensification of them is what we expect and what has been predicted and what we're now experiencing. That's not to say all of these events would not have happened if there wasn't climate change. Many of them would, but the intensity and the frequency is increasing, and those changes are accelerating. So that's the sort of classic climate change gloom and doom, but it's real and it's happening and it's costing us in many ways, and certainly ignoring it or pretending it's the normal conditions that we live by would be a falsehood. Finally, global warming is about it being hot, and it officially, the 2021 was the 6th warmest year on record. The last 8 years were all the 8 hottest years on record in the world. And so we continue to progress, even though year-to-year variability is quite real. And you can see on that plot over there, the year to year, some years are higher, warmer, some years are cooler. But the highest bars in this long bar graph back to for the last 45 years are all in the recent past. So those are the extreme events that are evidence of the changing climate. And we all understand the implications of those events for our overall economy, as well, in particular, for the people who live in the path of those disasters. Maine's climate future reports that I mentioned, the first one was in 2009, and we did an update in 2015. We did an update in 2020. And I'm going to use those to just highlight some of the data from Maine that shows how the climate is changing and continues to change with expectations into the future, largely from the most recent report, but drawing on all 3 of them. And the columns here in the center, this is the last 100 years. So these are the sort of real data. This really happened. And then this is some of the projections up to the mid-century. We have others that we've also developed since this report was released last year, or in 2020. In the last 100 years, it's warmed about 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit, and we expect that warming. We know that warming is continuing. We expect that another 1 to 3 degrees by 2050. The warm season, growing season, whatever terminology you'd like to use, is longer by roughly about 2 weeks. It varies across the state and obviously from year to year. But that change is accelerating, and we expect another 2 weeks by mid-century. High heat index days are increasing. Typically, we have had very few here in Maine. It's vacation land after all. But as the temperature increases, high heat index days are a combination of high heat and humidity, which has human health consequences. And we expect more, and the greatest increase will be in the coastal zone, where I won't say we are tonight, but most of you probably are tonight. I'm in the central zone. Precipitation has increased, and that has certainly been the thing that has caught Mainers' attention in recent years. Over the last century, we've gotten 15% more precipitation, and we expect another 5 to 10% more by mid-century. This is not only the overall precipitation, but also the increased frequency of these intense events that we've already referred to from this past year. It's warming, so we get less snow, roughly 7% less snow in the last 100 years, and a significant loss of snow, and there's lots of different metrics for snow, but from 20 to 40%, with the greatest losses in the coastal zone. This map over here shows the three colors across Maine are the three climate divisions, the formal climate divisions. And you're down here in Belfast, I'm up here in Orono. The greatest loss of snow characteristics, the greatest loss of winter characteristics will be in the coastal zone, because it's already warmer than the interior, and therefore more likely to either melt the snow or not form snow at all in the precipitation event. Ocean temperature is increasing. The Gulf of Maine, probably everyone on the call has heard that the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans, and particularly the group at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute has been responsible for that research. So it's warming, and that rate of warming is accelerating. That we all know has profound impacts on our fisheries and ecosystems in the Gulf. And we expect that to continue as well as accelerate. Sea level rise is obviously critical for coastal communities like Belfast. We've seen about 6/10 of a foot over the last 100 years. And I'll say more about where it's going in the future, but at a minimum, another 1/2 to 2 feet by mid-century, depending on the scenarios that we follow. The only climate dashboard component that's not on the dashboard is ocean acidification, which is the chemical change in the ocean waters, the acidification of the ocean waters. Primarily due to CO2 dissolving in it, but by other factors. And it was not on our dashboard because we don't have the kind of long-term data for ocean acidification, but we will, since there's a tremendous focus on the importance of that going forward. So those are some of the trends of climate change. Those are the kind of incremental year on year. Yeah, there's lots of variability. You see it in these curves. But the overall pattern, the overall trend, which is what we mean by climate rather than weather, is clearly pointing to change and accelerating change. A couple other slides that I include come from that other report I mentioned. The Science and Technical Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council prepared this report. Scientific Assessment of Climate Change and Its Effects in Maine. It drew on Maine Climate Future, but many other studies as well. And it was produced in last year. I'm using that to point to two pieces of information about the trajectory of change we expect going forward. And so this plot is showing the historical temperature record, which is the black line, and all those other lines are the models simulating the historical, since we know what that was. The scientists involved in this look at how well that it represents the real past. And then those models are then used to project into the future. And we don't need to get into the details of this curve, but basically what it's highlighting is that we have choices that we're making now. We're making them every day to determine the kind of future we will have. And so the most aggressive reduction of greenhouse gases has the possibility of bending the curve and flattening out the rising air temperature. The middle curve here represents probably more like the trajectory that we will be on. And the upper curve is if we do essentially nothing as compared to or in line with the trends over the recent decades, where we will get certainly the most extreme warming and all of the consequences that go with it. And so these projections were done as part of that assessment. And likewise for sea level rise, which was particularly important, the legislature charged the council and the STS with coming up with specific guidance on sea level rise, and you've probably all seen, and I know Belfast has used the projections of sea level rise to guide some of the climate planning. But the council's recommendations were to commit to manage for 1.5 feet of relative sea level rise by 2050 and 3.9 feet by 2100. Commit to manage meaning there's a high probability that these are the kinds of changes we will experience. And then the council also recommended to consider preparing, and you can see the language there, to manage for pretty much twice that. So 3 feet by 2050 and 8.8 feet by 2100. And the difference there being the prepare to manage has a lower probability of happening, but a higher consequence if it does. And it is well within the realm of reason to expect that we could see those kinds of sea level rise experienced in coastal communities all over Maine, including in Belfast. So that's the main climate future part of my comments and what we're expecting to see. There's a number of things we're not going to talk about tonight, but I mentioned them on this slide with the Mauna Loa data to just keep them in mind. One is, I guess I have mentioned acceleration. The point here is there's a rich body of science around the reality that most of these trends are accelerating. So not only is sea level rise increasing, it's increasing at a faster rate each year going forward. The notion of tipping points in the climate system. So certain things can happen very quickly, abrupt climate change, and calving ice shelves and melting permafrost and drought in tropical forests, et cetera, can have dramatic impacts in a relatively short time, particularly if the climate has been pushed to certain thresholds of change. The third one there is cost benefit, and that's just to basically allow me to emphasize that most of the time when we look at the actual cost of mitigation and compare it to the cost of doing nothing, doing something based on science is almost always cost effective. And we've seen this time and again in environmental legislation, particularly around the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act in the United States. And then the last one is attribution. And we've gotten a lot better in the scientific community about attribution, which is the ability to put a certain cause on a particular event. So what's the likelihood that a particular event would have occurred with and without climate change? Or if it occurs, what's the fingerprint of a changing climate or greenhouse gases on that event? And oftentimes you'll see events would have occurred, but they not have been as bad, or they would not have been as frequent. And that portion is attributable to rising greenhouse gases. So those are important aspects of considering our decision-making around a changing climate. You've probably all seen this before. This is the NOAA atmospheric carbon dioxide monitoring station at Mauna Loa, which for all the years I've been doing this, no one's paid for a trip for me to go see it. But nevertheless, it is the most widely used data stream of global CO2 change, because it's one of the earliest stations, and it's in an ideal location out on in the middle of the Pacific, without a lot of other sources of CO2 to compromise the quality of the data. And so what you see is CO2 continues to increase, and two things. One is it's not a straight line, it's a flex. And so CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere not only are increasing, but the rate of increase is increasing, just like all of these other indices. And despite COVID, right at the end here, you don't see a huge dip. December 2020, it was 414 parts per million. December 2021, it was 416. So despite all of the reductions in greenhouse gas emissions due to the slowdown in the economy that were real, that we heard in the news, that improved air quality, particularly locally, the CO2 continues to go up instead of going down. And not to spend too much time on data, but these are data from Maine. And so this is the NOAA Tall Towers monitoring site at Argyle, Maine. And these are the real-time data. And so that you see that the greenhouse gas, this one's CO2, for a shorter period of time that we just looked at. So it doesn't look quite as long and curved. From 2004 to basically the present. And again, despite COVID, you see that this continues to go up. It's got a annual pattern of highs and lows, but the mean continues to rise. And this is methane, which also is increasing and is about 30 times as powerful, depending on how you define it, but a greenhouse gas warming agent. And this is nitrous oxide, which is probably about 300 times as potent. Now, these are smaller units than over here on CO2, so CO2 still dominates, but these and other greenhouse gases all are contributing to the warming, and they're still all going up. And then finally, by way of trajectories, this is from the International Energy Agency. It's a plot that we used. This is an update report that we just released in December of this past year on the anniversary of the Climate Action Plan. We use this to highlight where we're at in the progression towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is in atmospheric concentrations. These are plots of emissions. And so this is the historical emissions that got us to where we're at. This is the projected future emissions to 2050 based on stated policies up until this past fall, actually. This is dramatically improved. So these are this is the trajectory of emissions. If all of the pledges that came out of the Glasgow, Scotland climate conference in the fall are held, which is a challenge. And yet this is what we need to get to be net zero by 2050, which is what we think we need in order to keep below a global 1.5 degree centigrade warming. So we still have our work cut out for us relative to emissions, and we also see evidence in the atmospheric data itself that CO2 is rising. So we have a significant challenge ahead of us, and we can hope for even more success when they reconvene with the UN later this year, basically. So that's all the reality. Not a lot of good news, but understanding where we're at and what to expect is important, and it informs the decisions that we make going forward. It also leads to the obvious question, okay, that's a lot of gloom and doom. And some of us have lived it in different ways and in different contexts, but what do we do about it? And I'm having done this kind of work in climate change as a scientist for many decades now. I'm really happy to say that the state of Maine, as of 2019, launched into the development of a climate action plan. And on December 1st, 2020, Governor Mills released the Maine Climate Action Plan, Maine Won't Wait. And this is Maine's first integrated adaptation, mitigation action plan, a strategy and a pathway forward in order to address both how we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and how we build resilience in our ecosystems, our economy, and our communities. And so I'll tell you a little bit. I know many of you are familiar with either all of it or aspects of it. Keep in mind, it's useful to know that in Maine, the sources of greenhouse gas emissions are dominated by transportation, which is 54%. And then as we work across this slide, residential and commercial is residential is 19%, commercials 11%, all the way down here to electric power generation. That's 7%. So transportation is more than half, and then buildings of all sorts are essentially another 30%. And so over 80% of our greenhouse gas emissions comes from those two sources. And therefore, the Climate Action Plan focused heavily on those in their strategies. Really quickly, the Maine Climate Council is responsible for developing the Climate Action Plan and updating it every 4 years. The council has 39 members, but it's supported by, in the context of it takes a village, it's supported by an impressive village of really committed people that some are on this call that are involved in the various committees. And so there's two subcommittees. One is the Science and Technical Subcommittee, I already mentioned. Another is the Equity Subcommittee that's looking to be sure that this plan promotes the goals of Maine people for equitable and just future. And then there's these 6 working groups that are named after the topics that they focused on, that were originally charged with coming up with recommendations that went to the 39-member council, and then the council boiled those recommendations down. We'll talk very quickly about them. And so these 6 groups, well, we'll mention these 6 groups in a few minutes, but there's roughly about 230 people involved, if you added up all the people involved on all of these committees supporting the 39-member Maine Climate Council. Important and sort of premier aspect of Maine's Climate Action Plan is the goal to reduce emissions. And the action plan seeks to reduce gross greenhouse gas emissions. This is our gross greenhouse gas emission trajectories from 1990. We peaked in the middle of the 2000s. And then it's declined since then. We were 10% below 1990 levels by, we were to be 10% below 1990 levels by 2020. We achieved that. But until this plan, we had no future targets. Now we have the targets of reducing gross greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030, 80% by 2050, consistent with reaching the goals of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And also by executive order, although there's a bill in the legislature now to make this law, to be carbon neutral by 2045. And we'll talk more about that in a couple minutes. Yeah. So the Climate Action Plan has 8 strategies, and those 8 strategies are the sort of integration and compilation of all of the strategies that were submitted by the working groups. These are the 8 strategies, and we're not going to go through them all here tonight. Just briefly mention the kind of what they focus on. The first one focuses on transportation because of the high source of emissions from transportation, and particularly, in short, electrifying our transportation system to the extent possible. The second one is about modernizing our buildings to be energy efficient because of their contribution that we saw. The third has to do with reducing carbon emissions by the way we produce energy. And within this is the goal for Maine to be 80% renewable by 2030 and 100% renewable by 2050 from our electric grid. D is grow Maine's clean energy economy. And so the governor's goal in this was to double the clean energy jobs by 2030 to roughly about 30,000 if it was doubled. E has to do with Maine's natural resources, carbon sequestration, and things I'm going to talk a little bit more about here tonight. And so we'll come back to that. F has to do with building healthy and resilient communities and investing in community action, which a lot of activity now is ongoing and expanding in this area. G is about investing in our infrastructure, and first and foremost was incorporating the up-to-date sea level projections into many aspects of Maine life and regulations. And then H is engaging people and communities in climate impacts and other activities having to do with outreach and education, a climate corps, highlighting excellence in Maine systems and activities that are addressing information about climate change. And Esperanza Stancios, that's on this Zoom, is on that working group. So though that's a broad brush of the strategies, there's a huge amount of information and a lot of it very accessible. There's a lot of it that gets a little dense. There's 3 websites that I point you to get more information. This one up here looks more business-like. It's on the GoPIF office, the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. It's the Maine Climate Council website there. That's the place to go if you want to find out information. It has links to some of the reports, certainly, but particularly information about the meetings and to be able to register for all meetings, and all of the meetings of these groups are public. This one here is the Maine Climate Council's Climate Action Plan website. So if you want to learn more about Maine Won't Wait, go there, and it has everything about the members and the subgroups and reports. And this is a relatively new one that is about what is happening as a result of Maine Won't Wait. It's all about Maine Won't Wait, as well as pointers to things that we can do to be involved as citizens. And so I encourage you to explore those websites and certainly contact the council with questions and interest going forward. Okay, good to take a breath. So that's all of the activities having to do, or all of the information from me tonight having to do with what's happening in our climate, what do the trends look like, what does Maine data tell us, and a framework at the state level for how we respond, and a very comprehensive framework. Okay, number 2 on my homework was to talk about soil health. And you don't have to twist a soil scientist's arm to talk about soil health. And so I'm happy to say something about that. It's relevant to the discussion we're just talking about, because in the category of natural resources and working lands, we've seen a renewed interest in society as well as in science around soil health. And so what is soil health, and why does it matter for climate? It matters for climate primarily because it has to do with how we can store carbon and how we can be resilient, how our ecosystems can be resilient. It's closely related to a term some of you know that is soil quality. Soil health is about the intersection of the chemical, physical, and biological properties of the soil. But just those alone are really what we've traditionally dealt with when we've talked about soil quality in agriculture and soil sciences. Soil health, the second bullet I have here, only living things can have health. And so the idea here is really focusing on the living aspects of the soil, microbial community and macroinvertebrates and roots in concert and part of the system that we know of as soil, which is organic matter and mineral matter and water and air and the chemicals and nutrients that are part of it. Soil health is important because a healthy soil is going to be more productive. It's going to withstand drought. It's going to hold more moisture during drought. It's going to store more carbon and keep it out of the atmosphere. And so that's one of the chief motivations. When we talk about soil health, it's kind of the simple version of what do we do in order to maintain or achieve soil health are three, this slide series has 3 points to make. And I think I made these slides a few years back for a talk in Belfast, actually, but that one was a live talk. Keep soil covered at all times. And so covered by mulch, covered by growing things, because it breaks the impact of raindrops, it breaks the energy of wind in order to keep soil in place. It takes a long time to grow soil, to make soil, and our very best soil is the soil that's at the top. And so the very first thing we lose when we lose soil is our very best soil that's at the top. So don't leave the soil bare. Second, diversify what is on the soil to the extent possible. And so monocultures are not good at maintaining soil. They don't necessarily maintain soil cover very well. And the kind of nutrient cycling and microbiological communities in the soil from a monoculture are less healthful, less robust than diverse plant cover. And so in agriculture, you get that through crop rotations. In other systems, you simply get it by allowing some of the natural diversity to persist. And then the C is don't disturb. And certainly, this is an extreme example of harvesting activity on a wet forest site, which obviously is having really very negative impacts on that soil system. And so some of the basics of how we can promote soil health are kind of easy to achieve. The world has really been wrapped up in promoting soil health. This is probably one of the more famous examples of initiatives in this regard. It's called 4 per mil. The French established this program that's worldwide now after the Paris Agreement, the UN climate meetings in 2015 that gave us the Paris Accord, and with the chief goal to build more resilient, robust ecosystems and to store a lot of carbon. And so there's a whole science around promoting this and the ways we can do this around the world and in different kinds of ecosystems. And so that's in a nutshell, that's kind of the story about soil health. What is it and why is it a climate change discussion? The third is, on the agenda for tonight still includes soil health, but there's a number of terms. This one's probably the most commonly used, natural climate solutions. And so this is one of those activities that is being promoted by the recommendations within that natural working land strategy in the climate action plan. In order to use our farms, our forests, and our marine systems to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly to take up and store carbon, keep it out of the atmosphere, as well as to build resilience. A little more sophisticated definition of what natural climate solutions is about is it's any action that conserves, restores, or improves the use or management of forests, wetlands, grasslands, and agricultural lands while simultaneously increasing carbon storage. And so that's the driving motivation here, or avoiding greenhouse gas emissions. And so that comes from a paper by Griscom in 2017 that looked at natural climate solutions in a way that is similar to what I'm going to show you in a minute here that we did in Maine. The idea here is that if we can, this is the emissions trajectory that we're on. If we can get off of fossil fuel, it gets us that far. And if we can store more carbon on an annual basis in our natural ecosystems, it can get us this additional increment that it gives us a better chance to get to, this is the less than 2 degrees. So this is trying to get to the 1.5 degree warming ceiling by using all means possible. So natural climate solutions aren't going to solve the climate concern, but they are an important and meaningful and significant component, as well as the benefits to the ecosystems that come from improving soil health and enhancing their management. What are natural climate solutions look like? Well, we've already talked about this a little bit with soil health, but in agriculture, they're talking about practices that include cover crops, conservation tillage to allow drainage, crop rotations to provide diversity, amending crops with compost that stores that carbon in the soil and enhances soil productivity. Restoring grasslands, and this is particularly important in rangeland areas. Using legumes in pastures that enhances the nitrogen and the productivity of the system. Again, grazing optimization, which becomes far more important in the Western United States than here. And then there's some emerging technologies, the ability to use biochar, which is really carbon rich as a soil amendment, and thereby storing that carbon in the soil and improving soil conditions, soil health. And deep soil inversion, which has to do with turning the soil upside down so this organic matter that was at the top now gets buried and stored, and allows a greater accumulation at the surface once again. In forestry, practices that are in this kind of a category, first and foremost, avoided forest deforestation. The best way to put carbon back in the atmosphere is to deforest the land, given the amount of carbon that's stored in our forests. We can store carbon by afforesting, reforesting areas. We can put set aside, so we protect some of the forests from being intensively managed. We can improve our management of the intensively managed lands, extend rotations, and a number of other silvicultural forest management kinds of practices. Adam Dagenau at the University of Maine led a group to evaluate some of the alternative natural climate solutions. And I'm not going to go through these, but what you're looking at here is a set of different practices for agriculture and a set of different practices for forestry in Maine that can be used to enhance carbon storage in the ecosystem. And the length of these bars represents the total greenhouse gas mitigation that would be possible if it was implemented to the maximum extent. And the different colors here are about the price of carbon that is required in order to motivate the implementation of these practices. And so we do more carbon sequestration if we put a higher price on carbon. And you see a number of these practices only offer a little bit of carbon advantage. They offer often a lot of soil health and resilience advantage. On the forestry side, because of the amount of forest that we have, we have some big opportunities to store additional carbon by various practices. And so you can get this report for those that are interested. You can go to the Forest Climate Change Initiative, FCCI. And so if you just Googled UMaine FCCI, it would take you to it. And there are fact sheets for our forestry, agriculture are combined, and then there's the full report for those that might be interested in that kind of information. Okay. And then finally, consistent with a drive to enhance the resilience of our ecosystems as well as store carbon, the past year there was a task force that was charged with coming up with recommendations on policies that could promote forest carbon. Click here. This is a page out of the Maine Won't Wait Climate Action Plan and Strategy E, the one we looked at that has to do with lands and natural working lands. Section 2 specifically stated that Maine was to establish a stakeholder process to develop a voluntary incentive-based, so it's not a regulatory or regulation, incentive-based forest carbon program for woodland owners of 10 to 10,000 acres and forest practitioners. The goal here was to focus on small to medium-sized woodland owners, not a focus on the large industrial landowners, which also there's work going on to address those. And so who is this cohort that owns these? Roughly 45% of the state of Maine forest land is owned by this cohort. And so the governor's task force was specifically focused on those goals. In response to the Climate Action Plan, the governor issued an executive order in January of 2021 to establish, this is the formal title of it, the governor's task force on the creation of a forest carbon program. That first convened in February. We met 10 times, and the final report was delivered on November 1, also on the Climate Council website. The task force had, I forget how many, 13 people. It was co-chaired by Tom Abello, who's a senior advisor in the governor's office, and Amanda Beal, who's our commissioner of Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. And then a number of individuals from NGOs, from the university, from trade organizations, and from some of the agencies that all work together for that period of time in order to come up with the recommendations that are in the report. There were 9 charges in the report, of which I'm not going to have time to go through each of them. I'm going to click through them, though, so that you can see what they were and say a word about the direction they went. The first was just to review available data on practice-based carbon programs, what's out there already by way of different carbon programs, carbon offset programs in the US, which we did. Review our current harvest levels and stocking, so we knew what amount of carbon and condition of the forest we were focused on in this task force. Look at climate-friendly forest management practices, and so the task force developed a set of recommended practices that would enhance forest carbon and resilience. Identify a suite of financial incentives and technical assistance, and the task force spent a fair amount of time on that, focusing on both of those opportunities with significant investment and recommendations in additional technical assistance for these landowners to be able to achieve the goals that they may want to achieve. Identify incentives for high quality on the ground performance for loggers. So there was some discussion and recommendations around the practicing loggers and the kind of training, not a requirement, but recommendations and resources and information available. Task force was charged to revisit the open space current use taxation program, which is one of the state programs like tree growth tax that promotes certain land management that will preserve land in its current use and thereby preserve and protect that, if not enhance that carbon. Explore partnerships and opportunities for large commercial forest landowners, and that discussion and activity is ongoing, and so the task force simply pointed to that as a worthy activity. Consider opportunities for multi-state forest carbon initiatives, and there are discussions, particularly with the U.S. Climate Alliance, for northeastern states to partner in carbon initiatives for these goals. And then finally, a popular one, recommend a numeric goal or targets for increased carbon sequestration in Maine over time. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that one, because when everyone thinks about a carbon program, they were thinking of new targets and additional sequestration. It's the data are incredibly important in order to understand what our goals should be in that regard. And so we looked at the historical data. I'm going to very quickly walk through these. This you've already seen tonight. This is Maine's gross greenhouse gas emissions stretched out a little bit from 1990 to roughly the present, to 2018. Okay, so you should kind of remember seeing it was peaked in the mid 2000s and then it declined. This plot is the amount of carbon, the amount of additional carbon on an annual basis that's being sequestered or that's being stored in our forests, because our forests are growing and have been more than we are harvesting from them. And so that additional growth that was not harvested is therefore sort of stored in our standing forest. And so this is the trajectory over time. And what you can see importantly is that we've seen it's below the line, meaning that it's taking up carbon, okay? And that's why it's not above the line. And so that we've seen, compared to the 1990s, we've been on an annual basis, year in and year out, storing a lot more carbon lately than we were back then. There's multiple reasons for that, and some of it has to do with the economy and less utilization, shutting down paper mills. Some of that has to do with characteristics of the stands and certainly the silviculture. In addition, there's harvested wood products, carbon that's in things like dimension lumber that we put in a house. That carbon's going to stay there for as long as the house stays there. And so that too is storing carbon. So of the harvested products that came out of the forest, some of that harvested carbon will be around for a long time. Some of it won't be. Paper, and if you burn it, it's going to go back to the atmosphere relatively quickly, but some of it will be. And some of the new products like cross-laminated timber, people are quite excited about the ability of that to even store more carbon in the future. So all combined, our forests, if we take the products and the net accumulating growth, would follow this line. So the total forest carbon sector in Maine followed this line, and over the last several decades has progressively increased. It's kind of stabilized at this point in time. And the point of all this is that if we subtract out the carbon that's being stored in our forests and forest products from the amount of greenhouse gases, the amount of greenhouse gases that are being emitted, to find out what's the net, what's left over that stays in the atmosphere, this is the subtraction. So if we subtract this line from that line, we get this line. And because our forests have been taking up more and more carbon and our greenhouse gas has declined slightly, we see a relatively significant decline in the net greenhouse gas emissions. And you remember Maine has a goal of being carbon neutral by 2045, which would mean this line gets to zero. So at that point, we are balancing all of the emissions by other processes that are taking up the greenhouse gases. And this line is the percent of our greenhouse gases that are being removed by our forests or overall, basically in Maine, because it's dominated by our forests over time. And what you see is that it's gone from maybe 30% to today, about 70% of the greenhouse gas emissions are offset, if you would, not in a legal frame, by our forests. You'll note, and why is this important? This is important because a lot of the goals of storing more carbon in natural ecosystems in Maine and offsetting greenhouse gases in Maine to get to carbon neutral has to do with our forests. The important part here is that the forests are doing a lot of the heavy lifting now, but also this trend has flattened out and may not continue to increase. And so the task force, all of that is to say that the task force recommended that a target, we were charged with coming up with a target, be no less than 12 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent per year through the year 2045, which in other words is saying if we can maintain the high level of sequestration we have now, we'll be doing good, because there's a lot of reasons to think it's going to decrease going forward, which means less will be offset in our forests. And so our target is not a brand new big high number, but our target is to try and maintain the ongoing capacity of our forest sector to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, primarily, basically carbon. Coupled with declining greenhouse gas emissions, we should then be optimistic we'll hit our target for carbon neutrality. And for the sake of time, we don't need to go through that just wrap up statement from the task force. So I kind of walked through those different phases. My closing thought here tonight is that as we started out talking, the indicators of a changing climate are accelerating. And if you look at the rate of sea level rise and at the tide gauges here in Maine, they've increased, and the rate of increase is increasing. And we can look at the rate of warming, and we can look at the rate of loss of snow and on down in these matrices. I am convinced or optimistic that the rate of solutions will also accelerate as we engage in them. And there's reason to be optimistic, particularly here in Maine, that we have this framework, that there's so much activity ongoing. You should download there's an update that was released in this past December when we released our climate update. There was also a progress report. It's a really great report and shows you all of the funding that's been applied and is directed to meeting many of the different goals of the action plan and the legislation that followed, all of the legislation that's been put in place to implement the plan, and all of the activity and progress that we're already seeing, from number of heat pumps to progress like we saw in these recommendations around carbon. And then finally, we've seen time and time again, as I already alluded to, that science-informed policy is cost-effective for all American citizens. And so true is the cost of climate action. It's not an impediment. It's not that we can't afford this. We can't afford not to address this climate crisis. And business as usual certainly is not an option. Even if you wanted business as usual, you need to respond to the storms and the fires and the rising sea level. And so why not embrace the science-informed solutions going forward? So with that, thank you.
Good. Thank you, Ivan, so much for this wonderful and information-packed presentation. We do have a few questions.
Sure.
One of your attendees is wondering about her perception that there's an increased amount of cloud cover along the coast, and she's wondering if this has any effect on the long-term viability of solar voltaics and solar electricity production here.
Great question. I probably can't answer that. I've been in the room when it's been asked before, and some of my colleagues are state climatologists, also didn't, I don't think, have data on that, was, hard data on that. But I've heard that, and it's reasonable given the higher percent moisture in the atmosphere as a result of warming, that in fact is something that we may be experiencing. So I don't know. Until we have the data, it would be hard to say. I mean, it certainly would have an impact on total solar radiation. I'd be cautious to think that it would have a significant detrimental impact on the cost effectiveness of solar. But again, that would just be my speculation.
Okay. Someone else is wondering about the impact of heating homes and businesses using locally grown and harvested wood, and mentions catalytic equipped stoves.
Yeah. So that's a really important question and a challenging one. It's right out of the box. It's certainly better than using fossil fuels. And so the challenge with biogenic energy use or burning wood is that it's still burning something. And so when you burn wood, that CO2 goes into the atmosphere. And the advantage is that that wood came from a tree that's going to regrow, hopefully. And as it does, it will reabsorb that carbon. So over centuries, there's no net new carbon to the atmosphere by burning wood. Our problem is it's 2022, and we have high expectations of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 in order to avoid the worst of climate warming. And the greenhouse gas emissions that we keep out of the atmosphere today is more impactful than the greenhouse gas emissions that we keep out of the atmosphere in 2030, and likewise in 2040 and 2050. And so there's an important trade-off between using wood because it does add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. There is the local pollution concern with wood, depending on the kind of systems, and I realize they talked about a catalytic converter, but so it's a balance. And my answer to this usually is the advantage of having a plan is that we can keep track with real data and science on how we're doing. And so if we want to expand our use of wood for energy, then we're going to need to accommodate that by being faster on getting off fossil fuels. Maine is full of wood. I mean, we're 89% forested. It's part of our culture. It's part of our economy. And so we've got to balance being able to utilize the resources with the goals of limiting greenhouse gas emissions and the climate. So that's a really purposely long sort of wordy answer to say, in a perfect world, I'd say don't burn anything. We want to keep all emissions out of the atmosphere, but we live in the real world. And so I think we do need to take advantage of some of those resources. And some of the wood, this is probably an important part on the forestry side, some of the wood that we burn is going to be back in the atmosphere anyway, because it's waste wood. It's materials that were left at the mill. They've already come out of the forest, and because they're in such a condition, they're going to decompose relatively quickly. And so if we can utilize those, then in place of fossil fuels, that's great. It's when we go into the woods and take out trees that otherwise we would not have, as we grow the bioenergy sector, that we need to balance that with a full accounting of greenhouse gas emissions if we're going to reach our I'm not going to do that talk. If we're going to reach our climate targets here in Maine. So I'll kind of stop there. Hopefully that addressed the question.
So you spoke about natural climate solutions, and I think during that section, someone asked if there was anything going on about trying to reduce impermeable surfaces, such as asphalt.
Yes, although I'm not the person to ask. So I think, and others on this call probably, or I know can answer better. Yes, that comes into play in particularly in communities when they're evaluating stormwater runoff and capacity of their municipal wastewater plants. The more impermeable surface you have, the more water is delivered to whatever's downhill. And too often that's our municipal plants and other infrastructure. And so, yes, that is part of the evaluation of community risk and flood risk. And I know Belfast has been involved in some of this kind of work, but I can't cite the sort of the specifics of what's gone on in Maine in that regard.
Another land-related question, I guess. Someone's asking about the siting of solar farms, and what about solar farms taking up agricultural land? Can there be limits placed on this?
Good question. And there's another task force while this forest carbon task force was ongoing that I think just released its report or about to release its report to address exactly that. That's a really important and challenging part of the development of solar that I think the state is acutely aware of. We lose about 10,000 acres a year to farms and forests to development. And so we want to stem that because development means more loss of carbon when it transitions. And yet we want to grow our locally grown food economy and protect our prime farmlands. So I don't know how this will come out relative to what the recommendations will be or new policies. But yeah, I definitely think organizations like Maine Farmland Trust as well are deeply involved in evaluating the risks associated with this and the best policy going forward. But we do have to be very careful to not give up our prime land to solar. There's some interesting study, I think in Rockland, not far from you, is one of the first sort of dual agriculture solar systems. I think it's a blueberry system. Some of you know, I'm sure. Say it again. Oh, I thought someone said.
Yes, I've heard of that also.
Yeah. And so there's some of those opportunities that I undoubtedly will grow. But we certainly don't want to lock up the best of our farmland, which is also challenged by the demographics of ownership of many of these farms and the next generation not particularly interested in inheriting the farm, and what happens to the farmland is an area of high concern. And so I think we'll hear more, but your point is really well taken.
A couple of questions relating to your forestry section. One person asks if there's a method of calculating the carbon storage per land unit of certain species of trees or mixed species of trees.
Yes. We can, I can't do it on the phone here tonight, but real time. But yeah, we can, we generally, I have a sense of it, but some of my colleagues that I work with do it for a living. We're pretty good at knowing the shape of trees, the rate of growth, be able to count the density of the wood, to be able to calculate the amount of carbon that they take up when they're growing at whatever that rate is, and how the species different. And with models, we can essentially put together the different compositions from monoculture to the more typical mixed forests, that particularly hardwoods that we have, in order to determine the amount of carbon that's being taken up. There's a number of applications that are out there, on the web, that can do that in a little more generic way. And so you can enter information about your the species and the age of your stand and get an estimate. But if you want to calculate it more specifically, yeah, we certainly, and that's becoming even more important than it ever has, with carbon markets developing and people being paid to sequester carbon. it's really important to be able to measure that. So for the above ground, I should add, for the below ground carbon, not so much. And so that's not just because I'm a soil scientist, but we don't have a good way to quantitate. We do in a research mode, but from the standpoint of larger land areas and monitoring and determining the amount of carbon in your soil and changes in that carbon in your soil as a result of land management practices is a challenge. And there's activities ongoing to try and figure out how do we do that best.
So another soil related question was, are there any recommendations to limit clear cutting forests by people who want to mine gravel or other minerals here?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know the linkage there between gravel extraction, mineral extraction, and clear cutting. Hasn't been part of any of the discussions that I've been involved with, so I really don't know about that. The practice of clear cutting itself, yes, as part of different options in some of the natural climate solutions. Yeah, I could say more, but certainly that has been part of the discussions, but not directly as a result of a desire to increase mineral extraction.
Okay, we have two more questions so far, and one I actually was wondering myself.
Sure.
So asks, isn't biochar made from burning wood slowly, and how is that good?
Isn't biochar?
What
Yeah,
type of
biochar
wood?
is made from burning wood. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Maybe that depends on what type of wood you're burning.
Well, it does. So biochar, you make char by, burning it slowly, but burning it in low oxygen. That's the key to making a char out of any biomass, switchgrass, what have you, and certainly wood. And so by burning it slowly, you lose, a significant amount of the mass, but you also retain a lot of the mass that was there. Maybe half of the mass is retained as a biochar. That what's attractive about the biochar to many is that carbon in a biochar and in that form in a biochar can enhance soil properties. It's very porous, so it can hold nutrients and water, and so it's known to have a positive impact on the soil health, on the characteristics of soils and their productivity. But it decomposes very, very slowly. And so it will stay in the soil for a long time. And so the attraction there is if we can put biochar in the soil, it'll enhance soil properties, but we won't lose that biochar carbon like we would for manure in a couple of years. That'll be there for maybe 100 years or a very long time. And so that's the whole attraction to biochar. In order to figure out whether it makes sense, you got to figure out, what did you burn? Where did it come from? How was it produced? Because yes, the production of biochar does emit a certain amount of greenhouse gases.
So we have one more question that was entered into the chat for everyone, but someone did just mention that she sent some questions directly to you, Ivan. So after this question, I guess I'll have to ask you to check your own chat messages. But the question before that is, it seems that many of our forests are affected by acid rain and invasive species. What can we do to remediate those two factors? That's a big question.
Yeah, I missed just the middle of it, but it has to do with the acid rain impacts and what we can do about it, right?
And invasive species.
Invasive species, that's the part I missed. Let me answer the acid rain question, because that one's a lot more fun. And I say fun because in 1990, our own Senator Mitchell led the charge to reauthorize the Clean Air Act. And the reauthorization of the Clean Air Act in 1990 specifically targeted acid rain, the reduction of sulfur and nitrogen, which are the causes of acid rain. And I've spent a lot of my life, I sort of went from acid rain into climate change because they're both about burning fossil fuels. In acid rain, we're looking at the minor pollutants, and in climate change, we're looking at the obviously the carbon that's emitted, but it's the same thing. The good news is, as a result of the Clean Air Act, where you are in Belfast, you're probably receiving about 80% less sulfur deposition from the atmosphere and about 50% less nitrogen deposition. I say that because I've worked up the numbers for Acadia, as compared to 1990. So we've seen dramatic recovery from acid rain in the sense of the acidity of the rain and the pollutants that are, the pollutants, sulfur and nitrogen, as well as improvements in particulates, but mostly it's the sulfur and nitrogen. As a result, we've seen dramatic increases in improvements in our ecosystems, and that's what I have done for my day job. And we had a watershed in down East Maine up near Beddington that we've studied for decades and watched the slow improvement in water quality. And therefore, the soils have reversed their acidification. Hard to demonstrate that because of the variability, but it's pretty clear. And therefore, we're on the right trajectory from the standpoint of forest growth relative to acid rain. And now, of course, our challenges of drought and temperature and changing seasons and other invasives. As far as invasives, that's I know a lot less, and it's a lot more complex issue. The destabilization of ecosystems by climate change typically tips the balance in favor of invasives. They are usually more aggressive, more opportunistic, depending on which ones that we're talking about. The challenge there is to first, educate and recognize them, and then do what we can to limit their arrival, because I see very few successful cases of reversing the invasive species, and particularly where invasive species are now only invasive because they didn't grow there before, but actually the climate has changed so that they're more suited to the habitat than the species that we were used to in the Maine of the 20th century. Some of them are really critical, and plant species and that many of you probably know more about than me. I'm going to mention it because I got off a call this morning on Asian earthworms and earthworms as invasive species, which is a real threat to our forests, since our forests typically don't have earthworms. And so programs to eliminate the vectors of transfer of whether they're seeds, or in the case of earthworms, soil that's on tire treads or in pots or other means, not the least of which is for some of the species, us going fishing in a lake in the middle of the woods and dumping our excess bait in the woods as a source of their entry. So I don't have an easy answer on invasive, really important. And sort of getting worse, but even harder to reverse than many of the other kinds of things I've dealt with.
Well, thank you very much. We have just a minute or two left. I'm going to ask if Nancy Galland would be interested in unmuting and asking you one of her questions. Maybe she's the person who entered questions, she said, into the chat directly to you, Ivan.
Oh, I see. Okay.
A question you'd like to ask Nancy before we close for the evening?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks. I was wondering why my questions weren't being mentioned, and so that's why. So one of the ones that is most interesting to me is when you mentioned that deep inversion of soil.
Yep.
That's always been my idea about turning soil, although plowing is a different story. But no-till methods are being promoted by MAFCA and other organic advocates. So what do you think of that?
Oh, I think it's great. I think it doesn't necessarily work for everyone, but no-till is clearly one of the key soil health strategies, because when you disturb the soil, you disturb that wonderful ecosystem that evolves between roots and microbes and worms and organic matter in the soil itself. And if you come on and pound it every year with a plow, you're sort of reversing many of the characteristics of soil health that we try to promote. So I think that's a great practice. The deep tilling, years ago, I can't remember exactly, but French intensive, I think, was the terminology.
Yeah,
that
yeah.
describe it. And the idea there is that there's more organic matter in the top of the soil because of all the plants and the roots that decompose, et cetera. And therefore, that's the rich, productive part of the soil. And so back then, it was about, if you invert the soil, you put that good stuff at the bottom, and you bring the bottom stuff up, but because it's on the top now, if you manage it over a few years, it too will accumulate organic matter. But now the soil below also still has its organic matter, and therefore the roots can invade and make more use of more of the soil volume. And so it was a productivity thing. Now we're talking about it because if you bury that carbon, it's not going to decompose very quickly down below. And now the upper soil has a greater capacity to store the new carbon that it gets. And so we get carbon sequestration accelerated, plus the carbon down there that's stored. And so it's a net positive from a carbon standpoint, and obviously potentially productivity. So I haven't heard a lot about that, but that has been a sort of consistent strategy that has been in the soils world for a long time.
But it stands in contrast and actually contradiction to the idea of no-till, where you do not disturb.
Yeah, sure.
So
Totally.
how does that square?
Well, if you, I haven't seen this what was called French intensive applied in Maine, at least. I think the notion there is to do the inversion and then practice no-till on what's on top. And so you've taken a higher level of carbon soil material, buried it so it's preserved for a long period of time. And then if you practice no-till, rather than continuing to till that upper soil, it will accumulate a certain amount of carbon to get into equilibrium to the new management. And now you'll have, a no-till, healthier soil at the top, and you'll still have the carbon stored at the bottom.
So it's a matter of something that being done over time.
Oh, absolutely. Right.
I think that's key to the understanding from what
Yeah.
you've described.
And almost outside of just adding carbon as organic matter or as biochar or as something else, almost all of the soil health measures that more, sort of more naturally develop enhanced soil health and carbon take time. When few data that I've seen, it's often 5 to 10 years, and you can begin to measure the enhanced level of carbon in that soil. But it doesn't happen in a 2-year span.
But that makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ivan. This is Brenda. And everybody for staying around for all those fantastic answers to questions. I now have a better understanding of biochar. I was the one that asked the question.
And Ivan, I want to add my thanks too.
Sure.
It
Thank
was
you
great
very much.
presentation.
Great presentation. Thank you so much.